to meet you. I'm Natasha, an underworld doctor. Feeling sick?
This is the tragic look into a character that had an arguably amazing kit in a game that would over time be developed with more and more seasoned characters. I won't name names, but someone would call these characters essentially downloadable content, or DLC for short, which is notoriously known in games to cause problems for the base roster. This is ultimately what Natasha fell victim to, despite having a design people genuinely love. Honkai Star at launch had a small but very diverse roster. For most classes, you at the very least had two options. The Hunt had multiple single target damage dealers, two of which were 5 stars. The Erudition had many AoE damage dealers, two of which were 5 stars, one however would show up a little later. The Harmony had multiple offensive buffers, one of which was a 5 star, however the other characters in the class weren't too far behind. The Destruction felt like the least big path with only having a few options, one of those being a 5 star. The Nihility had many offensive debuffing characters, one of those being a 5 star. The Preservation had only 2 options, both being the same element, just different rarities, or 3 really without the context of gacha characters. The most undeveloped path being the Abundance, having only 2 characters, one of those characters being a 5 star and the other being a 4 star. Natasha being the 4 star Abundance character that for many players would be one of the best characters to have on your account. Now what's important to take into consideration is that even though the Preservation and the Abundance are different how they operate, they're still looked at as being used in similar fashion, because the contents in the game offered at the time didn't make one path look better or more enticing than the other. This would change later on, however, when we talk about Fu Xuan's release. In the main story, there wasn't content you actually struggle with, unless you lacked one of the best damage dealers and or decided to use Natasha without another defensive character. Natasha being a character for free was her best selling point. There were so few ways to go about getting Bailu or Jeopard, and most people weren't yet sold on March 7th being used as a sole defensive option. As a new player, you were honestly thrilled to have Natasha on your roster because you could continue hunting for Bronya instead of having to worry about dedicating some regacha pools for getting a defensive support, because the game provided you with that early on in the story. There is one thing missing from the equation altogether, and it wasn't because of Natasha and her limitations, but Bailu's game-changing kit for new players was something that happened to be overlooked entirely. Bailu had tons of heals with her raw multipliers. This mattered a lot in the early game where relics were virtually non-existent and overall character level was very low. Bailu also had a revive, which was helpful because as a new player, mistakes are always made. You were getting accustomed to a new turn-based game, and aside from being spoiled, there was no way to tell what battles would await you. Bailu also healed you in the off turns. This is important because in fights that are longer, having heals serve as emergency heals means that your characters would essentially die less often and it was hard to catch you off guard. Natasha had an emergency heal for herself, which is okay I guess. Doesn't make her better than Bailu in that regard, because 5 stars have higher base stats than 4 stars anyways. Natasha also had heals on the off turn, but it required the character with the heal over time buff to take a turn, making it worse and worse the slower your character is, whereas Bailu's would proc upon taking a hit from the enemy. Natasha however had a cleanse, which would give her the slight edge in some situations, but players would soon realize, though Bailu lacked a cleanse, team building would help alleviate that issue altogether. If you didn't have the time or patience to deal with endless cycles of RNG, then you just didn't bother with the concept of re-rolling, and would just take what the game gave you, almost essentially playing the game as a roguelike, because Honkai Star was a gacha game at its core. A lot of your experience was tied to RNG in the game, but you could choose to simply not interact with those layers because the game gave you some freebies, so that was an option as well. If you chose to dwell in that endless cycle of RNG, you could end up with an account that has some of those best characters guaranteed early on, and could easily scale nicely into the hardest contents the game had to offer. If you happen to get your hands on the Grade 3, you essentially had 2 amazing defensive options for the late game, and an offensive buffer that had unrivaled synergy with the best defensive option at the time. Let me explain. The only thing stopping Bailu from completely dusting Natasha at launch was her lack of debuff removal, but since Bronya had a cleanse tied to her elemental skill that was used on the characters most vulnerable to crowd control effects, there would be nothing stopping this duo from clearing all of the contents in the game at ease. This was ultimately the nail in the coffin for Natasha. The video could honestly end here, but the truth is that Natasha still had a lot of usage for those that had no other option, or simply wanting to challenge themselves by avoiding the gacha altogether. With the arrival of the first limited gacha abundance, there would be a clear night and day difference between Natasha and that upcoming limited character. Luocha would release in 1.1, and for many players this was a character that gave a ton of value depending on who you had on your roster. If you had Natasha, then Luocha honestly gave you an entirely different experience to the game altogether. This powerhouse had an elemental skill of high scalings that would heal your squishiest characters to full with a debuff removal, and he had an off-turn version of his elemental skill that would have both the heal and cleanse attached with a 2-turn cooldown. Natasha's emergency heal was only used on herself, and it didn't have any way of cleansing herself either. Luocha also had built-in resist assist to crowd control, and a talent healing in the off-turn thanks to a passive that healed with dealing damage to the enemies. Not having a heal attached to an ultimate was amazing, and because of that, Luocha's ultimate could remove harmful buffs that opponents had, and revive mechanics the enemies had that also counted as a buff. It almost felt as if all the issues in Natasha's kit was the fix in Luocha's. Toughness breaking and being imaginary gave this character more offensive utility versus Natasha, and this would be the first time a character has clearly shown their overbearing strength versus a 4-star counterpart. Don't get me wrong, giving a skill point every turn is also impressive, but the same can be said for Natasha, depending on the scenario and situation she found herself in. This however meant you needed more investment into Natasha, despite being able to utilize Luocha with way less of that same investment. Natasha would see less play overall after the arrival of Luocha. This was really the point that every defensive option saw a downspike in usage, but Natasha truly being the one that would see the most. However, Natasha still had the perk of being given for free, and although her constellations weren't that impressive, being able to guarantee a healer without spending gacha currency on a healer is what would allow her to remain relevant in these dark times. Or light, depending on how you see it. Things would remain the same until we were to receive patch 1.3, and the same update would bring 2 new characters, one of those being direct competition to Natasha herself, with the arrival of Fu Xuan, whom just like we discussed earlier in the video, will compete with the defensive option category entirely, despite being different in how she operates. Fu Xuan was amazing, but at this point every player had the expectations of every defensive option being able to at least do the bare minimum. Keep the team healthy without having another defensive character in the same team, provide a skill point for the team, and have some extra utility alongside that, because Luocha had already set the bar just that high. What's important to note was that alongside Fu Xuan would be a 4-star Bundles character that was actual direct competition to Natasha herself. Lynx met the bare minimum barrier to entry that existed for defensive options. Lynx also had a team-wide cleanse, removing every single debuff from your allies, and would give those same allies heal on the off turn with her heal over time just like Natasha. Furthermore, despite being a direct upgrade versus Natasha with close accessibility, Lynx would also have some utility in the form of max HP increase aggro for high aggro paths like Preservation Destruction, and lastly a further heal with additional heal over time on that same elemental skill. This very strong skill is comparable to that of Bronya's, and Lynx would ultimately be the one to drop Natasha's usage to where it is currently, next to 0. Now while Natasha being free could still be a selling point of the character, and understanding how hard obtaining 4 stars are in Hoyoverse games, Lynx would be given for free in patch 1.6, which brings us to present Honkai Star Rail. Huohuo did release in 1.5, but at this point Natasha was already never brought up in discussions when it came to defensive options, so that would let us know a couple of things. Natasha benefited from lack of options early on in the game's lifespan. Natasha also had easy accessibility with her being a 4-star and given for free early in the game. Natasha had a cleanse which gave her an edge over Bailu in scenarios that you needed one and didn't have access to Bronya. As time went on, all of these issues would essentially be resolved and leave Natasha in the position she's in currently, a relic of the past. Considering Hoyoverse never buffs pre-existing characters, Natasha herself has 0 utility in her kit. She will ultimately never see play again. Having a beloved design can only bring you so far in a game that is ever so evolving with future releases. And let me preface, in most contests, Natasha is still enough to get the job done. And I think that alone is enough to at least be satisfied with the character's current state. Contents will get harder however, and she may become obsolete altogether. We'll see if that comes to fruition though. Thank you for watching and have a nice rest of your day.